Now, if we go back to earliest Christian apologists, and actually, you've got a modern apologist who's saying one thing. Go back to the earliest, the grandfather of all apologetics, Justin Martyr. Well, he's not special pleading. He goes the other direction with this. He says, this is just like what you're used to with the sons of Zeus and the Caesars and so forth. And so his argument is that there's nothing new. In fact, that's exactly the words he uses in Greek. It's unambiguous. There's absolutely nothing new with what we're doing with Jesus in our storytelling than what you're doing with your own demigods and in your tradition. And so why are you killing us? That's his argument. That's his apology that he's making there. That's the opposite of special pleading. I respect that, actually. And so if you go back into antiquity, if you look at some of his sources, he brings up people like Romulus. This is a founder of the empire who also had road encounters and had apotheosis, gave a great commission on the Via Appia, and it was one of the most famous individuals that was translated in the ancient world. In fact, when he was translated, it says his subjects fled in fear, kind of like the ending of Mark, actually. And so there's a calendric celebration of that throughout the empire. The people would reenact that in the cities, that particular event. And so he's taken up into a cloud right in front of them. And so it is a very, very important story. And most of the historians were obliged to include it. He has a road encounter, like I said, but he's not the only one. Aristeas of Proconnesus has a road encounter after he died. He dies in a fuller's shop. He's supposed to be a son of a god. He's a wonder worker. He's a poet. He's a divine kind of soothsayer. Dies in this town, and the shopkeeper closes shop and goes to inform the family. Well, when he gets back, the body's missing. It's vanished. And now the place is still locked up. So how did he get out of there? There's a question. He didn't have the keys to lock anything. And then not long thereafter, someone comes and says, hey, we saw him on the road to Cyzicus just now, and he looked, healthy and fine. And all of this. And so there's this road encounter. It's very much like the road to Emmaus in some ways. Now this predates the New Testament by centuries. So Aristeas, and then he comes back again centuries later and actually writes a book, has an appearance, writes a book, leaves that for everyone, and then says, hey, build a kind of a shrine to me here next to this other deity's temple. And so they go ahead and do that. And so he's worshipped as divine as the result of of his translated state, his post-mortem resurrection, so to speak. And so he's one that's super famous. They're Caesars. Numerius Atticus is said in Cassius Dio records that after the death of Caesar Augustus, this guy meets Caesar Augustus on the road, has a road encounter with him, and then goes and swears on oath in front of the entirety of Rome at the consecration of Caesar Augustus that he had seen him and had this conversation and stuff. And so Livius Geminus is another one that's super famous. This guy was so famous that Seneca actually teased him that he gets to see all the Caesars after they come back to life after their deaths. And so he meets them. He has all these road encounters constantly with each one. And so, and even some of their relatives. And so some of the aristocracy in Rome, they also received this kind of post-mortem exaltatio and in their memory. And so again, Proteus Peregrinus is another one that's super fun. And Lucian records him, and his disciples come back after. So he dies in the Olympic Games at 165 as a kind of a stunt in some ways that went wrong. And lo and behold, a couple days later, they see him in the portico of the Seven Voices. His disciples would come back. They come back and they report, we saw him, and he was wearing a gleaming white toga and a garland of olive, and he looked just fresh as daisies and everything. And this is after he had burned alive in front of a crowd. I mean, he was clearly dead. And so anyway, so you get the point here. This was a trope. It was a a general pattern. And in my own book, I call it the translation fable, but I'm not the only one who studied this. I've tried to present it in a comprehensive fashion. And so you get a full catalog. I record nearly 100 such individuals in my book throughout it that follow the same pattern, more or less, a cluster of different cultural signals, literary signals that indicate that someone had been deified through translation. And that's really what Paul is doing there. He talks about appearances and he talks about eyewitnesses. Now, those are two things that are conspicuously part of the translation tradition that are absent from other resurrection tales in the ancient world. Who else? Name one other person that rose from the grave and had appearances and eyewitnesses. That people talked a lot about the eyewitness of this or anything. It's not a thing. No one's talking, like Lazarus when he comes back to life. No one talks about the eyewitnesses that are there. No one talks about setting up a cult shrine. No one talks about him having appearances and coming and going and walking through walls and having to eat fish and all this stuff. It's just not a thing. And so, and you can go back through any number within the biblical tradition, go back to Elijah and Elisha. There's also resurrection tales there. If you want to go to more recent time within the larger Greco-Roman world, you've got legends that are surrounding Heracles raising people from the dead. You've got Apollonius of Tyana, wonder worker, who does a lot of the same things that Jesus does, casting out demons, but also raising people from the dead, raising someone from the dead. And if you go over to Asclepius, who's the famous healer of the ancient world, and really, in some ways, the great-grandfather of all of medicine, really, he also is said to have risen people from the dead in some of the legends that surround him. And so, again, there's no eyewitnesses, no road encounters, no great commissions given. There's no appearances or ascensions or any of that stuff associated with any of those individuals. That's all a cluster of themes that go with the translation legend. And that didn't take months or years or decades to pop up. In many cases, within hours and days after the individual had died, that people started to make these kind of claims. And so, in that sense, Jesus is not unique. And so I agree with Justin Martyr that he was not unique in that.